What's the most disturbing unsolved crime you've ever heard of? The one that still haunts you. He was murdered live on air over the course of 3 months. The killer was a voice on the phone. The only evidence was the static he left behind, and the victim's body was never found. I know because I was in the studio next door, listening to it all happen. You want to know the most disturbing unsolved crime I've ever heard of? The one that still haunts me. People usually talk about cases they saw on TV, a name from a newspaper headline that stuck with them. The Black Dahlia, Zodiac, John Benet Ramsey. They're like modern folklore. They're horrifying, but they're distant. They're stories. Mine isn't a story like that. Mine is a memory, a series of events that I didn't just hear about. I lived on the periphery of it. I breathed the same air, walked the same floors. I listened to it happen, piece by agonizing piece, over the airwaves. There was no body, no dramatic crime scene with yellow tape and no resolution. There was just a voice, a disappearance, and a silence that has been screaming in my head for over a decade. This was back in 2011. I was 24 years old, working my first real radio gig as the afternoon drive host at KBOS 91.5 FM in Port Blossom, a small, perpetually damp coastal town in Washington. It was one of those places that felt like it was always 50 degrees and drizzling, nestled between gray ocean, gray sky, and deep green forests. KBOS was a tiny station, the kind of place that still had a Lost Pets segment and broadcast the high school football games. It was my foot in the door of an industry I dreamed of being in. For me, it was a stepping stone. For Elias Vance, it was the end of the line. Elias, or Eli as everyone called him, was the host of the Midnight Hour, our late-night call-in show that ran from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Eli was a relic from another era of radio. He was in his late 50s, with a voice that was pure liquid velvet. It was a voice made for smoky jazz clubs and glasses of bourbon, not a rundown studio that smelled of old coffee and wet carpet. He was a local legend. People didn't just listen to Eli. They confided in him. His show wasn't about politics or hot topics. It was about the strange stuff, liminal spaces, existential dread, the mysteries of the universe, the quiet weirdness of being alive. He was a philosopher king ruling over a tiny kingdom of insomniacs, lonely souls, and graveyard shift workers. I looked up to him, of course. He was a master of his craft, but he was also a profoundly sad man. You could hear it in the pauses between his words. He'd been a big deal once, or so the rumor went. A major market host who'd had a spectacular flameout involving a bottle and a messy divorce. Port Blossom was his exile. He was brilliant, but he was also bitter and carried a kind of weariness that seemed to soak into the walls of the studio. The beginning of the end started with a caller. On a show like Eli's, you got your share of cranks, UFO abductees, conspiracy theorists, people who thought their neighbors were lizard people. Eli handled them all with a kind of weary grace. But this one was different. He first called in on a Tuesday night in early September. He didn't give a name. Eli prompted him. "You're on the Midnight Hour, caller. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then a voice, flat and calm, with no discernible accent or inflection. It was a voice like a placid lake, unnervingly still. "I was just observing," the voice said. "The way the light from the freighter on the horizon doesn't quite reach the shore. It promises illumination but only delivers a faint tremor. It's a metaphor, isn't it?" Eli, who lived for this kind of pretentious bullshit, was hooked. "A metaphor for what?" "For everything," the caller said, with that same unnerving calm. "For hope, for connection, for your voice." Eli dubbed him the Traveler. And for the next few weeks, he became a regular feature. He'd call once or twice a week, always from a number that came up as unknown. He never talked about himself. He only spoke in these strange, detached observations. He'd describe a leaf falling from a tree, or the way steam rose from a sewer grate, but he'd describe it with such intense, almost alien detail that it was mesmerizing. He became popular. People would call in just to talk about what the Traveler's latest call meant. He was Eli's perfect counterpart, his philosophical sparring partner. I thought it was creepy from the start. I mentioned it to Eli in the cramped break room one afternoon. "That Traveler guy gives me the willies, man," I said, stirring my coffee. Eli just smiled, that sad knowing smile of his. "He's just a lonely soul, Alex. Like the rest of my listeners, he's harmless." He was wrong. The shift happened subtly at first. The Traveler's observations started to get closer to home. One night, he called and said, "The wind chimes on the porch on Cedar Street are playing a sad song tonight, Elias." A 3-note melody of loss. Eli lived on Cedar Street. He had wind chimes his late wife had given him. He got quiet after that call, and I could hear the change in his voice for the rest of the show. He was shaken. A week later, the Traveler called again. "That was a bitter cup of coffee you had this morning, wasn't it, Elias? Sometimes the grounds betray you." Eli always made a pot of coffee in the booth before his show. It was a small detail, but it was specific. It was impossible. How could this anonymous voice know that? I cornered Eli the next day. "This isn't a fan, Eli. This is a stalker. You need to go to the police." He was defensive, angry even. "It's a gimmick, Alex. Someone's messing with me. They're probably sitting in the parking lot with binoculars. I can handle it. It's good for ratings." But I saw the fear in his eyes. He started being jumpy. He double-checked the lock on the studio door. He stopped taking his usual walk down to the pier during his breaks. The station manager, a perpetually stressed woman named Sarah, agreed with me. We tried to trace the calls, but it was a technical dead end. The number was spoofed, routed through a dozen IP addresses from all over the world. It was a ghost. Then came the dog. Eli had an old golden retriever named Gus, a creature he loved more than anything. Gus was his last living link to his wife. One Thursday morning, Gus was found on the beach, not far from Eli's house. He drowned. The police said the tide must have caught him, that old dogs can get confused and wander into the water. It was ruled a tragic accident. Eli was destroyed. He didn't come to work for 2 days. When he came back, he was a hollowed-out version of himself. The night he returned to the air, his voice was fragile, broken. And of course, the traveler called. "Hello, Elias," the calm voice said. There was no sympathy, just that flat, empty tone. "Grief is an ocean. You can try to stand on the shore, but eventually, the tide comes for everyone. It's better not to have attachments. They're just anchors that drag you into the deep," Eli snapped. It was the first time I ever heard him lose his composure on air. "Who are you?" he screamed into the microphone, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The traveler's reply was the single most chilling thing I had ever heard. "I don't want anything, Elias. I am simply an observer. I'm observing you shed the things that weigh you down. I'm observing you become lighter." Then he hung up. That was the turning point. The police were officially involved now. A detective named Morales came to the station, a tired-looking man who seemed as out of his depth as we were. He took our statements, listened to the recordings of the calls I had started to obsessively archive, and promised to look into it. But there was nothing to look into. No suspect, no evidence, just a voice on the phone. The calls became more infrequent but more pointed. The traveler started referring to me. "Your young friend is worried about you, Elias," he said one night. "He spends his evenings listening to old tapes. He thinks he can find me in the static. He can't. Some doors should remain unopened. Some voices are best left unheard." I felt a cold dread snake down my spine as I listened to that broadcast from my apartment. He knew about me. He knew what I was doing. I felt like a bug under a microscope. I started checking the locks on my own doors. Every creak of my apartment building at night was him. Every shadow in a dark corner held his shape. Eli, meanwhile, was disintegrating. He was drinking heavily. You could smell it on him when he came in for his shift. His show became a grim spectacle. He would ramble, talk to himself, and sometimes plead on air for the traveler to call, as if he needed the contact, as if the silence was worse. His audience was torn between horror and fascination. The ratings, as he'd morbidly predicted, had never been better. Sarah wanted to take him off the air, but Eli refused. He clutched onto that show like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. It was all he had left. He felt, I think, that his entire life had become a battle of wills between him and this disembodied voice, and he was losing badly. The end came in the first week of November. The coastal storms had started to roll in, and the town was battered by wind and rain for days on end. On Monday, Eli came on the air and sounded different. He sounded calm, resigned. He announced that his show that Friday would be his last. He was retiring. He thanked his listeners, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, echoing the very tone of the man who had systematically destroyed him. The traveler did not call on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. The silence was deafening. It felt like a predator holding its breath, waiting. We were all on edge at the station. I begged Eli not to do the last show. "Just walk away, man." I told him. "Don't give him the satisfaction." "It's my show, Alex," he said, his eyes distant. "I'll finish it my way." Friday night arrived with the worst storm of the season. The wind howled against the studio windows, and the rain came down in sheets. It felt like the world was ending. I couldn't go home. I told Sarah I was staying to work on some production elements, but really, I was there for Eli. I sat in my own darkened studio down the hall, the monitor tuned to his broadcast, my heart pounding in my chest. Eli was surprisingly lucid. He played old songs, told stories from his early days in radio. It was a nostalgic, melancholy farewell. He sounded like the old Eli, the one I had first met. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it would be okay, that he would walk out of that booth and this nightmare would be over. At 1:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the end of his final show, the call-in line blinked. It was an unknown number. My blood ran cold. I could hear the slight click in my monitor as Eli accepted the call. "Elias," the voice said. It was the traveler. That same dead, placid tone. A fine performance. Eli was silent for a long moment. Then his voice barely a whisper, he said, "What do you want?" "I told you, I don't want anything," the traveler said. "I am simply an observer. And the observation is complete. It's time, Elias. The tide is coming in." Then the voice did something different. It started to describe a path. "You'll go out the back door of the station. The wind will feel cold on your face. You'll walk across the gravel parking lot, past the dumpster, to the old wooden steps that lead down to the beach. Be careful on the third step. The wood is rotten. You'll feel the wet sand under your feet. The waves are loud tonight. You just have to walk towards the sound. Keep walking until you no longer feel the ground beneath you. It's not an ending. It's a return. I'm waiting for you, Elias." There was a click. The traveler was gone. Eli said nothing. He didn't sign off. He didn't say goodbye. He just let the outro song, a melancholic jazz track by Bill Evans, play. I sat frozen in my chair, listening to the music, my mind screaming. When the song ended, the automated system kicked in, playing a pre-recorded PSA. I bolted from my studio and ran down the hall to Eli's booth. The on-air light was off. I threw the door open. The room was empty. The microphone was still hot. His coat and wallet were on the chair. His car keys were on the console. And on the rubber floor mat below the console, there was a single, wet, sandy footprint, rapidly being absorbed by the worn material. I screamed his name. I ran out the back door into the raging storm. The wind nearly tore the door from my hand. I scrambled down the slick, wooden steps, instinctively avoiding the third one and onto the beach. The ocean was a roaring black chaos. The tide was high, crashing against the seawall. There was no sign of anyone. He was just gone. The police investigation was a joke. They had a missing person, a series of untraceable phone calls, and a witness, me, who sounded like he was crazy. They searched the beach, brought in Coast Guard boats when the storm cleared. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence he ever even entered the water. Eli Vance had simply vanished. Detective Morales treated me like a suspect for a while. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea of a voice being a murder weapon. He thought maybe I'd had a falling out with Eli, that I'd invented this whole elaborate story. But the call logs and my recordings back me up. They showed the unknown calls, the escalating weirdness. They just couldn't trace them. The traveler was for all legal purposes a ghost. The case went cold in 6 months. The station rebranded a year later. Sarah quit. I couldn't stand being in that building anymore, in that town. I moved away, took a sales job, and left radio behind forever. So what happened to Elias Vance? That's the question that haunts me. Did a real person, a meticulous and technologically savvy psychopath, torment him and then physically abduct and kill him on that final night? Did he somehow get into the station and lead him out? Or was there never another person at all? Did the traveler, through sheer psychological torture, convince a depressed and broken man to walk into the ocean and end his own life? Did Eli leave that sandy footprint himself on a prior trip to the beach, or did a killer leave it? The police could never prove a crime occurred. Without a body, he's just a missing person. But I know what I heard. I heard a man being dismantled, piece by piece, by a voice in the static. I heard a murder take place over the course of 3 months, a murder where the only weapon was words. That's the most disturbing unsolved crime I know. Because it's not just unsolved, it's undefined. It lives in that gray area between a malicious crime and a personal tragedy, and the not knowing is its own kind of prison. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I'll turn on an AM radio and just scan the dial, listening to the crackle and hiss between stations. And a part of me, a terrified foolish part, is always listening for that calm, flat voice, waiting to hear it begin another observation.
Thanks for watching. If you got this far, leave a comment, like if you liked it, and follow for more.